Nathan Cole set the divorce papers on the dinner table without even looking at his wife. He didn't sit down. He didn't take off his coat. He just stood there in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and when Evelyn turned from the stove and saw what was lying next to the candles she'd lit an hour ago, the wooden spoon in her hand went still. "I need you to sign those tonight," he said. That was it. No preamble, no apology. 7 years of marriage, and the man she had loved enough to give up everything for couldn't even be bothered to take off his coat. If you've ever loved someone so completely that you made yourself smaller so they could feel bigger, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's see just how far this story travels. The dinner had taken Evelyn 3 hours. Not because she was a slow cook. She wasn't. She had spent most of her adult life learning to do things efficiently, quietly, without making a fuss, and cooking was no different. But this dinner was different. She had driven 40 minutes to the specialty market on the other side of town to get the saffron he liked. She'd gone to 2 separate stores looking for the right wine, the one from the region in northern Italy where they'd spent 4 days on what passed for their honeymoon, a trip they could barely afford at the time, paid for partly on credit, both of them laughing about it on the train because neither of them cared. She had taken out the good tablecloth, the one they never used, still folded in the same crease from the day they got it as a wedding gift. She'd ironed it. She had set the table with actual effort, moved the fruit bowl off to the counter, found the 2 matching candlesticks at the back of a cabinet where they'd been sitting untouched for years. She told herself she wasn't desperate. She told herself this was just a nice anniversary dinner, a gesture, a reset. That was the word she'd been using in her head for weeks. Reset. Like what was wrong between them was just a setting that had drifted out of calibration, something that could be corrected with a nice meal and a good bottle of wine and a real conversation. She had been telling herself a lot of things lately. Nathan was supposed to be home by 7. She'd texted him at 6 to remind him, something she hated doing because it always felt like she was managing him, and she didn't want to be the kind of wife who managed her husband like a project. He responded with a thumbs up, just the emoji, nothing else. By 7:30, she turned the burner down to low. By 8, she poured herself a glass of the wine and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the street, watching headlights pass on the wet pavement. It had rained all day, one of those gray November rains that never really committed to being anything dramatic, just hung in the air and made everything feel damp and slightly miserable. The kind of day that had no business being anyone's wedding anniversary. She heard his key in the lock at 8:20. She had her back to the door, stirring something that didn't need stirring, and she heard him come in, heard the familiar sounds. Keys on the hook, briefcase set down. A pause that lasted a second too long. She registered the pause without turning around. She registered that he hadn't said anything. No hey or sorry, I'm late, or even her name. She turned. He was still in his coat. He was looking at the table. Not at her. At the table, at the candles, at the set places, and the good tablecloth and the wine already breathing in the decanter she'd found at the back of a cabinet. His expression was hard to read, but it wasn't warm, and it wasn't sorry, and it didn't have any of the sheepishness she might have expected from a man who was 90 minutes late to his own anniversary dinner. He was holding a manila envelope. He set it on the table next to the candles. He stepped back. "I need you to sign those tonight," he said. Evelyn looked at the envelope. She looked at him. She set the spoon down on the stovetop rest with a careful, deliberate movement, because her hands had gone slightly unsteady, and she didn't want him to see that. "What is that?" she said. It wasn't quite a question, her voice already knew. "Divorce papers." He said it the way you'd say grocery list or insurance forms. "I've been sitting on this for a while. I didn't know how to bring it up, but I think it's better to just—" He made a gesture with his hand that seemed to mean, get it over with. Just do it clean. She stood very still. The candles were burning. The wine was breathing. Something in the pot on the stove was probably overcooked by now, and some part of her brain registered that and found it, absurdly, the saddest detail in the room. 7 years, she said. "I know. 7 years, Nathan. Today." "I know what day it is, Evelyn." She looked at him, really looked. The way you look at someone when you're trying to find the person you thought you knew underneath the face they're currently wearing. He was 38. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He had the posture of a man who had made a decision and was relieved to finally be delivering it, which was almost worse than anything else. "Is there someone else?" she said. He didn't flinch. That told her everything. Her name is Isabella, he said. Isabella Beaumont. Her father runs Beaumont Capital. Evelyn had heard of Beaumont Capital. Most people who followed finance had. It was one of the older private banking dynasties in the Northeast, the kind of institution that didn't advertise because it didn't need to, that operated in a register of wealth so established it had become almost architectural, built into the city's bones, invisible to most people, immovable. "You're leaving me," she said slowly, "for the daughter of a banking empire." "I'm leaving because this—" He looked around the kitchen, at the small house, the second-hand furniture, the dinner she'd spent 3 hours making that he hadn't once looked at. "This isn't enough. This isn't what I want. I've been trying to want it, Evelyn. I have, for a long time. But I can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "This." The word came out with an edge she hadn't heard before, or maybe she had heard it before and had been telling herself it was something else. "Living like this. Always scraping, always making do. You're happy with small things, and I'm not. I've never been. And I'm done pretending." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I have never once asked you to pretend." "No," he said. "You've just asked me to be satisfied, and I'm not." He picked up his briefcase from where he'd set it by the door. He still hadn't taken his coat off. "I'll stay at a hotel tonight. I'd appreciate it if you could look those over and get them back to me by end of the week. I had my lawyer make it straightforward. There's not much to divide." He said that last part with a kind of practical efficiency that was, she realized, the cruelest thing he'd said yet. There's not much to divide, as though 7 years had amounted to nothing worth splitting. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft, ordinary click. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a long time, long enough for one of the candles to burn down unevenly and start dripping onto the tablecloth she'd ironed, long enough for whatever was in the pot to go past saving. She didn't cry. Not yet. She reached over and picked up the manila envelope. She pulled out the papers. She read them. Not quickly, not skimming, but actually reading, page by page, the way her father had always taught her to read any document before reacting to it. "Never let a piece of paper ambush you twice," he used to say. "Read it once to feel it. Read it once to understand it." Those are two different things. Her father. She hadn't let herself think about him in hours, but he came to her now, unbidden. Harold Sterling. The man who had built Sterling Global from a regional investment firm into a multinational corporation over the course of 40 years. Methodical, private, ferocious in business, but surprisingly gentle at home, at least with her, his only child, his daughter he had raised alone after her mother died when Evelyn was 11. The man who had handed her the full leadership of everything he'd built the day she turned 25, and watched with quiet devastation 7 months later when she sat across from him in his study and told him she was leaving. Not leaving the company, she'd said, leaving the life that came with it. She had met Nathan at a charity function she'd attended as a stand-in for her father, who had the flu. Nathan was a junior account manager at a mid-size investment firm, charming in a low-key way that she found unexpectedly refreshing in a room full of people performing their ambitions at full volume. He didn't know who she was. Or rather, he knew her as Evelyn, a woman in a good dress who laughed at his jokes and argued with him about a film she'd seen twice, and he hadn't seen at all. He didn't know about the Sterling name. She hadn't volunteered it. She went home that night thinking about him. She hadn't thought about a man like that in years. Men she met in her professional life were always either intimidated by her position or interested in what it could do for them. And the distinction between those two things had started to feel academic. Nathan was neither. He was just a person. A real, imperfect, unremarkable, in the best possible way person. They dated for 8 months before she told him anything about her family. By then, she was already in love with him, or what she understood love to be, which included a significant amount of hope and a willingness to overlook things she might otherwise have noticed. She told him not about the fortune, not about Sterling Global, just about her father's business background. She said it was a successful investment company. She let him assume successful meant comfortable, not enormous. She had her reasons. She'd spent enough time around inherited wealth to know what it did to relationships, how the money became a third presence in the room, shaping everything, warping dynamics in ways that people were usually too polite to acknowledge. She wanted to know what they were without it, She wanted, just once, to have something that belonged entirely to her. She told her father what she was planning a week before her wedding. The conversation was one of the worst of her life. Not because he yelled, Harold Sterling never yelled, but because he sat across from her in his study with the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to show how much something hurt. And he said, "Evelyn, you are asking me to watch you disappear." "I'm not disappearing," she'd said. I'm just living. Living as someone else. Living as myself. The self that isn't a CEO or an heiress or a Sterling, just me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "And if this man, if this life, turns out not to be what you imagined?" She didn't answer that. She didn't have a good answer. She had a feeling, which at 29 she had mistaken for certainty. Her father signed over formal management of Sterling Global to Alejandro Reyes, his longtime chief of staff, and the man who had served as his operational right hand for 15 years. Not a transfer of ownership, Evelyn remained the sole heir, but a transfer of active authority, temporary in theory, indefinite in practice. He set up a legal structure that would maintain her rights over the estate in full. He told Alejandro to keep everything exactly as she had left it. Then he stopped calling, not out of cruelty, out of respect for the choice she'd made. She called him once a month on Sunday evenings. Those calls were short and careful. Two people who loved each other conducting themselves across a distance they'd both agreed to, but neither one had fully accepted. He died 14 months ago. A heart attack, swift and without warning, in the study where they'd had that last real conversation. Alejandro had called her. She had driven to the city alone, sat in her old office for an hour without turning on the lights, and flown home the next day to the house she shared with Nathan, who had been sympathetic in all the appropriate ways without fully understanding what she'd lost. She had not reclaimed her position at Sterling Global after his death. She had told herself she wasn't ready. She had told herself there was still something to save here, in this house, in this marriage. She had told herself a lot of things. Standing in the kitchen now, holding the divorce papers her husband had deposited next to her anniversary candles, like they were a utility bill he'd been forgetting to address. She was done telling herself things. She put the papers back in the envelope. She folded it in half and set it on the counter. She went to the stove and turned off the burners. She blew out the candles. She picked up her phone and stood in the dark kitchen and pulled up a contact she hadn't called in over a year. Alejandro answered on the second ring. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was careful, the way it always was when he was surprised, which was often. "I need to come in," she said. A pause. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear something shifting in it, not just surprise, but something closer to relief, like a man who had been holding a difficult posture for a very long time and had just been told he could set it down. "I'll have everything ready," he said. She set the phone down on the counter. She stood in her kitchen, her small, carefully maintained, completely ordinary kitchen in her small, completely ordinary house, and she looked around at all of it, the chipped tile above the stove they'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, the curtains she'd sewn herself because they couldn't afford what she'd wanted at the store, the photograph on the refrigerator from 3 summers ago, the two of them at a beach in Maine, both squinting into the sun, both looking happy in the uncomplicated way that photographs sometimes preserved, even when the truth had already started moving in a different direction. She took the photograph down. She held it for a moment. Then she set it face down on the counter and went upstairs to pack a bag. Evelyn had not seen the Sterling Global headquarters building in 7 years. It was on the 43rd floor of a tower in Midtown, not the tallest building in the city, but positioned in a way that felt deliberate, like a face at a table that had no interest in competing for the head seat because it didn't need to. The lobby was the same as she remembered, pale marble, high ceilings, the particular quality of silence that came from serious money insulating itself from ordinary noise. Alejandro was waiting for her at the elevator bank. He was 61 now, silver-haired, wearing the same kind of dark suit he'd worn every time she'd ever seen him. He had a face built for composure, sharp features that didn't soften easily, eyes that missed very little. When he saw her step out of the car, something moved across his expression too fast to name, and then it was gone. replaced by the professional steadiness she'd always found both reassuring and slightly exhausting. "You look well," he said. "I look like a woman who didn't sleep," she said. "You look like your father," he said. "Come upstairs." The office had been maintained exactly as she'd left it. That, more than anything, hit her in a way she hadn't braced for. She stood in the doorway and looked at the desk, the view, the framed photographs. Her father at company milestones, the two of them at her college graduation, a picture of Harold Sterling shaking hands with a former head of state at an economic forum 20 years ago. The chair behind the desk was positioned the way she always positioned it, slightly angled, not quite square to the surface. "You kept it like this on purpose," she said. "Your father asked me to." She walked to the window. The city was gray and bright at the same time, the way it got on cold November mornings when the sun was up but doing nothing useful. She could see the park from here, the river beyond it, the distant smear of bridges. "Where are we?" she said. "As a company. Right now." Alejandro moved to the desk and opened a folder. He was in briefing mode immediately, which she appreciated. "Strong. Revenue is up 14% year on year. The Harrington acquisition closed in September. That added 2 secondary market portfolios we'd been eyeing for a while. There are 3 active negotiations I'd want you in on as soon as possible, and the board has a quarterly meeting in 3 weeks. Who on the board knows I'm coming back?" "No one yet. I wanted to wait until I heard from you directly." She turned from the window. "Tell them this afternoon. I want it in writing before the market opens tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment, not surprised exactly, more like confirming something he'd already suspected. "The announcement will get attention. There will be questions about where you've been." "Let them ask." Nathan has a lawyer and a hotel room," she said. "He doesn't have anything else to do with this conversation." Alejandro nodded once. He closed the folder. "There's one other matter. Beaumont Capital." She went still. "We've had peripheral dealings with Beaumont for years. Nothing major. Some overlapping interests in a European fund, minor board representation in 2 shared portfolio companies. In the last 8 months, someone named Nathan Cole has been introduced into Beaumont's inner circle, reportedly through a personal relationship with Reginald Beaumont's daughter. He's been positioning himself as a deal-sourcing contact, using certain information about Sterling Global's interests and approach that he should not have had access to. Evelyn looked at him. "He talked about our business," she said. "Specific enough to be useful, nothing classified but directional, conversations he could only have had with you." 7 years of pillow talk. 7 years of her occasionally venting about a deal or a board dynamic or a challenge she was navigating internally, not because she was careless, but because she had believed she was talking to someone who loved her, someone she could trust, someone who had no interest in her professional world because he'd never known it was hers. The anger that moved through her was cold and very clear. "I see," she said. "I didn't want you to be blindsided." "I appreciate that." She moved to the desk. She put her hands on the back of the chair. "Pull together everything we have on Beaumont's current exposure. Active positions, debt structure, anything you can get on the deals Nathan's been involved in facilitating." "That's," Alejandro paused. "That's going to be read as the opening of a very deliberate campaign." "Yes," she said. She pulled the chair out and sat down in it. It felt the way she remembered. "It is." He looked at her for another moment. Then he allowed himself the smallest thing that might, in a different man, have been a smile. "I'll have the files on your desk within the hour," he said. The weeks that followed were not triumphant in the way that people, if they'd been watching, might have expected them to be. There was no sudden transformation, no moment where Evelyn Sterling stepped out of her suburban life and into her empire like someone putting on an old coat that still fit perfectly. It was harder than that. She was rusty in ways that surprised her. Not on the fundamentals, the analytical instincts, the read on people, the ability to hold multiple competing considerations simultaneously while appearing to focus on only one. Those came back quickly, almost physically, like muscle memory. But the pace of it, the noise, the sheer volume of decisions required every day, the number of people who needed things from her, the weight of having her name on a company again. She went home to the hotel room she'd taken near the office and sat on the edge of the bed some nights feeling genuinely wrung out in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with recalibration. She also signed the divorce papers. She signed them 8 days after Nathan left them on the table, without annotation, without contest, without the kind of strategic hesitation that a meaner version of herself might have employed. She had Alejandro's legal team review them, not to fight them, but to ensure there were no irregularities, no clauses that could be used to claim community interest in anything she was about to rebuild. And when they confirmed the documents were clean, she signed on every line and sent them back. Nathan's lawyer contacted hers the following Monday. The marriage was dissolved within 30 days, which was fast even by the standards of an uncontested filing. Evelyn assumed Nathan had pushed for speed. He had somewhere to be. She got a text from him 2 weeks after the papers were filed. Just 4 words. "I hope you're okay." She looked at the text for a long time. Then she put her phone in her desk drawer and went back to work. The team at Sterling Global adjusted to her return faster than she'd expected. Some of the senior staff had been there since before she left and treated her reappearance with a kind of professional relief, as though her absence had been a disruption everyone had been too polite to name. The younger hires, the ones who'd come on in the last 7 years, were more cautious. She was a name they'd heard, a reputation that preceded her without any actual person attached to it, and watching them recalibrate their understanding of who she was gave her a complicated sort of satisfaction. She worked. She worked the way she'd always worked when she was fully in it. Long hours, direct communication, a preference for getting into the actual details of things rather than delegating her way into abstraction. She was not always easy to work with. She had a sharpness that came out under pressure, a tendency to ask the question that exposed the weakness in an argument before anyone else in the room had seen it, and a very low tolerance for the kind of hedging that passed for analysis in presentations built to impress rather than inform. People learned quickly. She was also, she had to acknowledge, trying to outpace something. When she wasn't working, the other things crept in. The particular silence of the hotel room, the moments when she'd reach for her phone out of habit and then remember there was no one to call, the low-grade disorientation of having to reconstruct an entire sense of her daily life from scratch. She wasn't sleeping well. She was eating inconsistently. She had a recurring thought in the early mornings, that specific hour between 3 and 4 when defenses were down, where she wondered whether she had wasted 7 years or whether she had needed them, whether she had been foolish or brave or some combination of the two that she didn't have a clean word for yet. She didn't let those thoughts linger, but she had them. What she did not have was regret. She was clear about that, surprisingly clear, in a way that she held on to in the difficult moments. Not about the marriage. The marriage had been a mistake, not in conception, but in execution. Not because she had loved Nathan wrong, but because she had loved a version of him that turned out not to be fully real. And she had done the thing that people in love sometimes did, which was to furnish the gaps with her own best hopes and call it knowledge. But she didn't regret walking away from Sterling Global for 7 years. She had needed to know who she was without it. The answer had been painful to get to, but it was an answer, and she had it now, and she wouldn't have gotten it any other way. She had needed to know that she could choose her own life. What she hadn't quite anticipated was learning, the hard way, that choosing your own life still required you to face everything it costs. She was facing it now. One day at a time, one decision at a time, in a midtown office that still had her father's things on the shelves, and a view of a city that had kept moving without her. She was back. Not triumphant, not restored, not the same woman who'd left, and not the woman she'd been in the kitchen with the candles either. Something else. Something still in the process of being determined. The board meeting was in 3 weeks. She had a lot of work to do. The board meeting happened on a Tuesday. Evelyn had spent the 3 weeks leading up to it doing what she'd always done before high-stakes rooms. Not rehearsing exactly, but loading. Reading everything, talking to everyone worth talking to, constructing a clear picture of where the company stood not just on paper but in practice, in the actual texture of its operations, its people, its unacknowledged problems. Alejandro had briefed her daily. She'd had one-on-ones with each of the 7 division heads, some of those conversations comfortable, some not. 2 of the 7 she wasn't sure about yet. Not disloyal, but not fully committed to her return in the way that would matter when things got complicated. And she knew from experience that things always got complicated. She walked into the boardroom at 9 on the dot, which was 2 minutes earlier than she'd planned, because the elevator had been faster than expected and she'd decided not to stand in the hallway waiting. Small thing. She noted it and moved on. There were 11 people at the table. Most of them she knew. 3 she'd never met. Every face turned when she came in, and there was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe less, where the room held itself in a kind of suspension, like a breath that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be inhaled or released. Then, Martin Greaves, the longest-serving board member, 72 years old, and someone who had sat across from her father for 30 years, stood up. "Evelyn," he said. She shook his hand. "Martin, you look the same. I'm considerably older and slightly more arthritic," he said, which made 2 other people at the table laugh, and something in the room's temperature adjusted itself. She took her seat at the head of the table. She didn't make a speech. She'd considered one and decided against it. Anything she said by way of formal reintroduction would be either too much or not enough, and the people in this room were going to judge her on what she did over the next 6 months, not on anything she said in the first 10 minutes of a Tuesday morning. She opened her folder, looked up, and said, "Let's talk about the Harrington integration." That set the tone. By the time they broke for coffee 2 hours later, she had asked 31 questions, pushed back on 2 financial projections that she found optimistically structured, and identified a personnel gap in the European division that no one had apparently wanted to raise directly. Martin Greaves caught her eye across the room during the break and gave her a nod that was small and serious and meant something. She didn't feel triumphant leaving that meeting. She felt tired and focused and like she had a lot of work to do, which was, she recognized, exactly how she'd always felt after a productive day. It was a feeling she'd missed without fully knowing she'd missed it. She took the elevator down alone and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold, watching cabs move through the intersection, and she thought, okay, this is still me. This still fits. Then she went back upstairs. The weeks following the board meeting passed the way intensive work periods always did, in a blur that paradoxically felt both very fast and very long. She closed 2 of the 3 pending negotiations Alejandro had flagged, one of them requiring 4 days in back-to-back sessions that left her hoarse and running on hotel coffee, and the particular stubbornness that came from being the only woman in a room full of men who had assumed, early in the process, that she would compromise before they did. She didn't. The deal closed on her terms with a minor concession on a secondary clause that she'd offered strategically, not out of necessity, because sometimes the cleanest path to your actual objective was letting the other side believe they'd gotten something. Her father had taught her that. She caught herself thinking about him often during those weeks. Not grief, exactly. It had been over a year since he'd died, and the acute edge of it had softened into something more chronic, more textured, the kind of loss that didn't announce itself but was simply present, woven into the ordinary fabric of the day. She'd find herself in the middle of a complicated decision and think, he'd have gone left here, or he would have asked that question differently. Sometimes she found it useful. Sometimes it just made her tired. She moved out of the hotel and into an apartment on the Upper East Side. A rental, not a purchase, because she wasn't ready to make a permanent decision about where she wanted to live, and she'd learned to be suspicious of the kind of certainty that arrived too quickly in the aftermath of something hard. The apartment was a reasonable size, modern, impersonal in the way that furnished rentals were impersonal, and she was fine with that. She bought 2 plants. One of them started going yellow within a week, which seemed about right for where she was emotionally. She did not date. She didn't think about dating. She thought about work, and about her father, and occasionally about the house she'd left behind. Not with longing, but with a kind of curiosity, the way you might think about a room you'd lived in for years, and tried to imagine how it looked now with the furniture rearranged. She'd heard from Alejandro, who heard through a legal channel, that Nathan had put the house on the market. It sold in 11 days, which told her the market was either strong or Nathan had priced it low to move fast, and she found herself hoping, with a tiredness that surprised her, that he hadn't gotten less than it was worth. Not for his sake. Just because the house had deserved better than to be rushed. She did not contact Nathan. He did not contact her except for one email, 2 months after the divorce was finalized, that arrived on a Sunday evening and which she read standing in her kitchen with a glass of water. Evelyn, I've heard you're back at Sterling Global. I'm not sure what to say about that, except that I understand now that there were things I never understood before. I'm not asking for anything, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Sincerely, Nathan. She read it twice. Then she closed the email and put her phone down and looked out the kitchen window at the building across the street for a while, not thinking about anything specific. She didn't write back. It wasn't cruelty. She thought about it. Whether or not responding was a choice made from hardness or from something more honest. And she decided it was neither punishment nor indifference. It was just that she had nothing to say yet. The anger was still present, lower now, less sharp, but still there, and the grief. For the marriage, for the years, for the person she'd believed she was building something with, was also still present in its quieter way. Writing back required her to locate somewhere inside herself a register that was neither angry nor grieving, and she couldn't find it yet. Maybe she would. Not yet. She filed the email in a folder and went back to the proposal she'd been reviewing. It was around this time, roughly 3 months into her return, that the Beaumont situation started to develop in ways she could see clearly, even though she wasn't actively engineering any of it. Alejandro had assembled the file she'd asked for in those first days. It was thorough, as his work always was. Beaumont Capital's current holdings, their debt structure, the sector exposures that were most vulnerable, and a careful audit of the 2 shared portfolio companies where their board representation overlapped with Sterling's. What it showed was a firm that looked strong on the surface and was quietly overextended underneath, having made a series of leveraged bets in a real estate development corridor in the southeast that had looked smart 18 months ago and looked considerably less smart now, as 2 anchor projects had stalled in permitting disputes, and a third had gone over budget by a margin that was going to require restructuring. None of this was public knowledge. It was the kind of thing that lived in quarterly filings and board reports and the private conversations of people who followed these things closely. But Evelyn followed these things closely. She always had. She didn't move against Beaumont directly. That would have been ham-fisted, and she had never been ham-fisted. What she did was simpler and considerably more effective. She identified 2 institutional investors who had been weighing whether to roll over their positions in the Beaumont-adjacent real estate fund, arranged meetings through channels that looked entirely routine, and in the course of those meetings, she answered questions and offered analysis that, while accurate in every particular, made the risk picture considerably clearer than it had been. Both investors made their own decisions. Neither decision was good for Beaumont. She also made 2 phone calls to board members at the shared portfolio companies, both conversations ostensibly about routine governance matters, and raised, in a measured way, questions about financial exposure that prompted those boards to request more detailed reporting from Beaumont's representatives. The requests were entirely reasonable. They were also time-consuming and inconvenient to fulfill, and the process of fulfilling them surfaced a discrepancy in one fund's quarterly reporting that turned out to require an accounting review. None of this was visible to anyone as a pattern. It looked like a scrupulous new CEO doing thorough corporate governance work, which it was. The fact that it was also something else was simply a matter of context, and context was not something Alejandro put in writing. She was playing a long game. She had always been better at long games than short ones. What she hadn't accounted for, or hadn't fully accounted for, was Nathan. She knew from the file Alejandro had assembled that Nathan had been inserted into Beaumont's operations at a fairly junior level, despite the personal relationship that had gotten him there. Reginald Beaumont was a cautious man by reputation, and whatever his daughter's feelings were about Nathan Cole, Reginald wasn't going to hand significant responsibility to a man who had no institutional track record and whose prior career had been mid-market account management at a firm most people in this room had never heard of. Nathan was being used as a social asset, an introduction maker, a relationship cultivator, the kind of role that looked significant at cocktail parties and was considerably less so in actual operational terms. She understood, processing that information, that Nathan had not gotten what he'd left her for. He'd gotten proximity to it. He'd gotten the appearance of it. He'd gotten Isabella Beaumont's affection and a business card that said Strategic Partnerships Consultant, which was a title that could mean many things, and in Nathan's case probably meant a salary, a nice office, and a growing realization that the world he'd chosen was considerably more stratified and difficult to enter than it had appeared from the outside. She felt something when she understood this. Not satisfaction, not quite. Something more complicated. Something with grief still in it. She closed the file and put it in the cabinet and went to her next meeting. It was a Friday afternoon in late February, 4 months after she'd come back, when she first saw Isabella Beaumont in person. It wasn't orchestrated. Evelyn was leaving a lunch near the park, a working lunch with the head of her European division, who was in town for 2 days, and as she stepped out onto the sidewalk, she nearly walked directly into 2 people coming the other way. She registered the woman first, tall, mid-30s, wearing the kind of effortlessly expensive clothing that people wore when money was so normal it didn't require display, dark-haired, conventionally beautiful, in a way that photographers loved and that Evelyn had always found slightly abstract, like a face designed by committee. Then she registered the man beside her, Nathan. He saw her at the same moment. The 4 of them stopped on the sidewalk. Evelyn's lunch companion, who didn't know any of these people, took a polite half-step back. Nobody said anything for a moment. Nathan looked. She searched for the right word and found several that were close, but none that were exact. Embarrassed? Yes. Caught. But also something she hadn't expected, which was smaller than the last time she'd seen him. Not physically, but in the quality of his presence, the easy confidence she'd always associated with him, even at the end, even when he'd been delivering divorce papers in his coat, was different now. Tighter, more careful, more aware of being watched. He was wearing a suit she didn't recognize, well cut, certainly more expensive than anything he'd worn when they were married. But his face looked tired in a way that the suit couldn't reach. "Evelyn," he said. "Nathan." She kept her voice level. She looked at the woman beside him. Isabella. Isabella Beaumont's eyes moved between the 2 of them with the particular alertness of someone who has heard a name many times and is meeting the person behind it for the first time. Her expression was composed but not entirely relaxed. She was clearly more socially skilled than Nathan at this particular moment, which was not a high bar. "Evelyn Sterling," Isabella said. Not a question, more like a confirmation of something she'd already calculated. "That's right," Evelyn said. "I don't want to keep you." She nodded to Nathan, a nod that was not unkind and not warm, just present, and moved around them on the sidewalk and walked on. Her lunch companion fell into step beside her. He said nothing for half a block, which was the right instinct. Then he said carefully, "Old acquaintance?" "Something like that," Evelyn said. She kept walking. Her face was neutral. Her heartbeat, she noted with some annoyance, was slightly elevated. She had expected in the abstract that running into Nathan would be unpleasant. What she hadn't quite predicted was how specific the unpleasantness would be. Not the big dramatic feelings, the anger or the grief, but the small, precise discomfort of seeing a person you'd been genuinely intimate with standing next to someone else on a Tuesday sidewalk, both of them wearing their choices, all of it irreversible. That was the part you couldn't prepare for. The irreversibility made visible outside a lawyer's office, outside the privacy of your own processing. Just there, on a sidewalk in February, between a lunch place and a crosswalk. She went back to the office. She worked until 7. She had a glass of wine in her apartment that evening, alone, looking out at the city, and she let herself feel all of it without trying to manage it. The anger and the grief and the something else she still didn't have a name for, the thing that was maybe just the cumulative weight of a chapter of her life ending, and another one not yet fully begun. She let herself feel it, and then she went to bed and she woke up, and she went to work. It was a week after the sidewalk encounter that Alejandro came to her office with something new. He sat across from her desk. He always sat, never stood for these conversations, which she appreciated because standing created a false urgency. And he opened a folder and said, "Nathan Cole has been talking." "To whom?" "3 journalists so far. 2 business press, 1 general. Nothing published yet. He's in the conversation stage, planting seeds." Alejandro's tone was measured, but she'd known him long enough to hear what was underneath it. "The narrative he's offering is that Sterling Global's sudden resurgence under your leadership is being deliberately orchestrated to damage Beaumont Capital, and that the motivation is personal." "Personal?" she said. "The divorce." He's framing it as a scorned woman using a corporation as a weapon. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, enormous. Is he naming sources? She said. He's claiming insider knowledge of Sterling's strategy. The implication is that you discussed internal plans with him during the marriage. I discussed general thinking, nothing material. I know, but general thinking, reconstructed creatively through the frame of a personal vendetta narrative, can be made to sound like a great deal more. She leaned back in her chair. Who are the journalists? He named them. She knew two of them by reputation. Serious people, not tabloid, not inclined toward drama for its own sake, but also not immune to a good story. The third name she didn't recognize, which Alejandro said meant the outlet was newer and hungrier. How far along is he? She said. Early. These are preliminary conversations. No one has committed to running anything. My read is that he's testing whether there's interest before he invests more. Your read is usually right. Yes, Alejandro said without false modesty. She thought for a moment. Who else knows about this? My contact in the media relations space. No one else yet. Keep it that way for now. She picked up her pen, looked at it, set it down. I'm not going to preempt this with a statement. I'm not going to reach out to the journalists, and I'm not going to have anyone else reach out. I'm not going to react to something that hasn't happened yet. That's one approach. What's the other approach? Counter-narrative. Controlled visibility. Some strategic press that emphasizes the substantive merits of what you've been doing so that if his version lands, there's already a different frame in place. She considered this. That's not wrong. It's also not urgent. You have time. Get me a list of business press contacts who've covered Sterling substantively in the last 3 years. People who have institutional knowledge of what this company actually is, not just the headline version. She paused. And I want to see whatever you can find on what Nathan's actual role at Beaumont looks like right now. Concrete things, not impressions. I'll have that by end of week. He closed the folder and stood. At the door, he stopped. There's one more thing. There always is. The Harrington portfolio has a subsidiary in the Southeast Real Estate Corridor, specifically in one of the development zones where Beaumont has exposure. He said it carefully, choosing words the way a man chose footing on uneven ground. If Sterling chose to exercise an option on that subsidiary's debt position, which we have the right to do under the acquisition terms, it would create a complication for Beaumont's restructuring timeline on the overlapping project. Evelyn looked at him. That's not something I'm recommending, he said. I'm flagging it because it exists. I know, she said. Leave it with me. He left. She turned back to the window. The option Alejandro was describing was entirely legitimate, a standard provision in the acquisition agreement, the kind of thing that routinely went unremarked because no one ever bothered to exercise it. Exercising it would not be illegal. It would not be unethical in any technical sense. It would also be exactly what Nathan was currently telling journalists she was doing, weaponizing the corporation for personal reasons. The fact that his accusation was, in this specific instance, at least partially accurate, was not something she found comfortable to sit with. She turned the question over in her head for 2 days. She talked to no one about it, not even Alejandro. She went through the numbers herself, ran the projections, looked at what it would mean for Sterling's position absent any Beaumont consideration, and the honest answer was that exercising the option was in Sterling's financial interest, regardless of who it inconvenienced. It wasn't a good deal for Beaumont by accident. It was a good deal for Sterling on its own merits. That was true. She was also aware that she was capable of believing convenient true things more readily than inconvenient true things, and that awareness was one of the more useful things she'd inherited from her father, who had been scrupulous in the same uncomfortable way. She didn't exercise the option, not because she was protecting Nathan, and not because she was afraid of how it looked. She left it alone because when she stripped away everything else, the history, the anger, the calculated long game, the satisfaction she could feel waiting somewhere further ahead, she looked at it clean and decided it wasn't the move she wanted to make. She was building something. She was doing it on her own terms. And her terms had a standard that she intended to maintain, not because it made her feel virtuous, but because the moment she started making financial decisions primarily as vehicles for settling scores, she would be exactly the person Nathan was describing to journalists. She called Alejandro and told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the right call." "I know," she said. "It doesn't feel as good as the other one would have." "That's also usually a sign it's the right call." She allowed herself a small, dry exhale. "You've been spending too much time with my father's philosophy." "I spent 30 years with your father," Alejandro said. "Some of it was bound to transfer." She ended the call and pulled the next item in the stack toward her and got back to work. Nathan Cole, in the meantime, was having a harder spring than he'd anticipated. The journalists he'd been talking to had not, as of mid-March, published anything. One of them, the most senior of the three, had come back to him with a series of follow-up questions that were increasingly specific about the sourcing and documentation behind his claims. And Nathan, who had been operating on the assumption that narrative momentum and personal certainty would carry more weight than they apparently did with serious business journalists, found himself without satisfying answers. The story stalled. At Beaumont, the quarterly review that had been quietly triggered by the governance questions Evelyn had raised had turned into something more substantial. The accounting discrepancy in the real estate fund had been resolved. It turned out to be a categorization error, not fraud, which was a relief to Reginald Beaumont, but not especially reassuring to the institutional investors who'd been watching the process. And the resolution had required Beaumont's senior team to spend 6 weeks focused almost entirely on internal documentation rather than active deal-making. In that 6 weeks, 2 deals that had been in late-stage negotiation had gone cold, picked up by competitors who'd moved faster. Reginald Beaumont was not a man who expressed displeasure loudly. He expressed it through reassignment. Nathan's title remained the same. His access to senior meetings did not. Isabella, to her credit, said nothing directly about any of this. She was not a person who said things directly when indirectly was available, which Nathan had found sophisticated when they first got together and was beginning to find exhausting. They went to dinners, attended events, maintained all the visible structures of a functioning relationship. But there was something in the quality of her attention that had shifted. She was present, but slightly elsewhere, the way a person was when they were quietly reviewing a decision they'd already made and hadn't yet announced. Nathan was aware of all of this and not quite willing to acknowledge any of it. He was 38, living in a city he hadn't fully cracked, in a relationship whose warmth was decreasing by degrees, at a company that had tolerated him and was now tolerating him somewhat less. He had sold his house. He had signed divorce papers. He had made a set of choices based on a picture of his future that had looked clear from where he'd been standing, and the closer he got to it, the less it resembled what he'd seen. He thought about Evelyn more than he wanted to. Not romantically. That was gone. He was honest enough with himself about that. But in the way you thought about a person when you were trying to understand something that wasn't adding up. When you kept returning to a moment or a choice and running it through different framings, trying to find the one that made it make sense. He had not told Isabella about Evelyn's return to Sterling Global for 3 weeks after he'd first heard about it, and when he finally mentioned it, he'd framed it as an industry development rather than something personal, which was the kind of framing that worked until it didn't. Isabella had looked at him with the same calm, measuring expression she usually wore and said, "I know, my father mentioned it." And Nathan understood from that, from the order of who had found out first and who had mentioned it to whom, exactly where he stood in the information hierarchy of the Beaumont family. On a Wednesday evening in late March, he was in his apartment, a rented place in Midtown, too expensive, too large for one person, chosen when he'd still believed his circumstances were going to improve quickly. And he was going through his phone, not looking for anything specific. And he found the draft of the email he'd sent Evelyn in January. He'd saved a copy in drafts without quite knowing why. He read it again. "I understand now that there were things I never understood before," which was true. It was also vague in a way that he recognized, reading it now, was a symptom of not being ready to be specific. He still wasn't fully ready to be specific, but he was beginning to see the shape of what the specific things were. He had known, in the back of his mind, that Evelyn came from money. He'd known it the way you know something that you've been told without context. Her father's successful investment company, the ease she had with certain situations, the way she navigated expensive restaurants when they occasionally went to them, The absence of anxiety around money even when money was tight, which he'd read as temperament rather than background. He had known, and he had not asked, because not asking preserved a version of things that he had preferred. He had also known, though he would not have said this out loud to anyone, that Evelyn was smarter than him, not in ways that she announced. She didn't announce things, which was one of the qualities he'd loved about her, and also, eventually, one of the things that had made him feel, obscurely, that he was always standing slightly outside something, unable to fully see the shape of it. She held her intelligence the way she held everything, quietly, from the inside, without display. He had mistaken that for simplicity. He had needed her to be simpler than she was, because if she wasn't, then certain things about his choices became much harder to justify. He put his phone down and sat in his expensive, empty apartment and looked at the ceiling for a while. He didn't know yet what Evelyn had built. He didn't know what she was building. He knew the name Sterling Global, knew it better now than he had a year ago, and he was beginning to understand, in a way that arrived not all at once but in pieces, each piece adding weight, what the name meant, what the scope of it meant, what it meant that the woman who had sat across from him at a kitchen table for 7 years had been carrying all of that quietly, underneath the ordinary life she'd offered him, the whole time. He didn't know yet what that cost her. He was starting to wonder. Outside his window, the city was lit up and indifferent, and the spring was coming in slowly, the way springs did in the Northeast, with cold still in the air even when the light had changed, everything almost warm and not yet, the season taking its time making up its mind. He had a meeting in the morning that he wasn't particularly looking forward to. He had a relationship he didn't know what to do with. He had a career that was moving sideways when he'd been promised it would move up. And somewhere across the city, in an office on the 43rd floor of a building he now had reason to know very well, the woman he had left was doing the work of rebuilding an empire. Not to impress anyone, not to show him anything, not even particularly to beat him, though the beating, if it came, would be thorough and clean and well-earned. She was doing it because it was hers, and it had always been hers, and she had finally stopped pretending otherwise. Nathan turned off the light and went to bed. He did not sleep well. The invitation arrived in April. It came through Sterling Global's events office, the way all institutional correspondents did, routed through 2 assistants before landing in Alejandro's inbox and then, summarized, in Evelyn's morning briefing. The Whitmore Foundation Gala, London, 2nd Saturday in June. Black tie, seated dinner for 400, the kind of event that existed at the precise intersection of old money, new influence, and the performance of philanthropic intent. Sterling Global had been a Whitmore Foundation donor for 11 years. Her father had established the relationship, had attended the gala himself 3 times before his health made transatlantic travel impractical, and the foundation had since named a fellowship in his honor. Evelyn read the briefing note, circled the date, and wrote confirm attendance in the margin. Alejandro, when she handed it back to him, read the margin note without expression. "You're planning to go yourself. It's the fellowship named after my father. It would be odd if I didn't. You haven't attended an international event since your return. Then this is a good one to start with." He looked at her for a moment with the quiet assessment she recognized as him, deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking. "Beaumont Capital is also a Whitmore Foundation donor," he said. "Reginald Beaumont almost always attends." "I know," she said. Another pause. "Nathan Cole has been listed on the Beaumont delegation for this year." "I know that too." He nodded once, closed the folder. "I'll have the London team prepare the arrangements." She turned back to her desk. She was aware, and she was honest with herself about being aware, that something had shifted in her thinking about Nathan over the preceding weeks. Not towards softness, exactly, but towards something that felt more like conclusion. The anger was still there. The sense of having been used, of having her loyalty treated as a weakness to be managed rather than a quality to be honored, had not diminished in any fundamental way. But it had clarified. It had stopped being a fire that moved unpredictably and become something more controlled, something she knew the shape and temperature of, something she could direct. She wasn't going to London to confront Nathan Cole. She wasn't going to manufacture a scene or engineer a humiliation. She had spent 5 months building something real. 5 months of decisions that she could defend to anyone. 5 months of work that spoke for itself. And the Whitmore Gala was simply the moment when the world outside this building would see the full picture for the first time. That Nathan would be there to see it too was a fact she noted and filed and refused to let become the point. The point was the work. The point was always the work. She told herself this with enough conviction that she almost entirely believed it. In the 6 weeks between confirming her attendance and boarding the flight to London, Evelyn closed one of the most significant transactions of her return. It had been in quiet negotiation since February, a strategic partnership with Takahashi Ventures, a Tokyo-based innovation firm led by Adrian Takahashi, 44 years old, founder of 3 companies, known in international finance circles for an approach that combined rigorous analytical discipline with a genuine commitment to sustainable infrastructure in underserved markets. Sterling Global had overlapping interests in 2 sectors. The partnership, if structured correctly, would open access to a development corridor in Southeast Asia that Evelyn had been watching for years. She'd had 4 calls with Adrian before agreeing to meet in person. He was direct in a way that she found immediately comfortable, not abrasive, but uninterested in the kind of performative indirection that consumed so much energy in high-level business conversations. He said what he meant. He asked what he wanted to know. When she'd pushed back on a valuation assumption in their 3rd call, he'd been quiet for 5 seconds and then said, "You're right, let me rework that, just like that. No ego management, no face-saving pivot, just acknowledgement and adjustment." She'd noted that. They met in New York in mid-May, a working dinner at a restaurant near her office, just the 2 of them and their respective notes. He was taller than she'd expected from the photos, with a directness in his face that matched his voice and a way of listening that was genuinely attentive rather than performatively so. He ordered simply, didn't talk about the restaurant the way people did when they were trying to fill space, and within 20 minutes of sitting down, they were into the actual substance of what they were trying to build. The dinner went 3 hours. They ordered dessert, which neither of them ate much of because they were deep into a disagreement about risk allocation in the 3rd phase of the Southeast Asia corridor that turned out, on examination, to have a resolution they both found better than either of their original positions. That was the kind of disagreement Evelyn liked, the kind that produced something new instead of just establishing who was more stubborn. "I want to be clear about something," Adrian said, somewhere near the end of the evening, setting down his coffee. "My interest in this partnership is entirely on the merits. Sterling Global has assets and positioning that Takahashi Ventures needs, and I believe this is a genuinely good structure for both companies. But I've done enough deals to know that when there's a significant power differential in the early stages, and there is one here, your firm is larger and better established than mine in the markets that matter most to this partnership. The risk is that the smaller party becomes a passenger rather than a driver. I'm not interested in that." She looked at him. "Neither am I. What does that look like, practically?" "Joint governance on the corridor projects. Not advisory. Actual governance. My people in the room when decisions get made, not briefed after. That's workable. And I want a clause that protects Takahashi Ventures' position if Sterling's leadership changes in the next 5 years. I'm not suggesting that's likely, but I'm not building a 3-year partnership on the assumption that any one person stays indefinitely." She appreciated that. She told him so. "Most people in your position would have waited until the term sheet to raise that." "Most people in my position would be worried about seeming difficult," he said. "I'm more worried about signing something I'll have to unwind." They shook hands at the end of the night. The formal term sheet went to lawyers the following week. It was signed 6 days before she flew to London. The flight was overnight, which she'd requested. She slept better on overnight flights than she did in her apartment, which said something unflattering about her apartment. She arrived in London at 7 in the morning, checked into the hotel, slept for 3 hours, and spent the afternoon in a meeting with the Sterling Global UK team, who were solid and slightly overworked and visibly relieved to have her in the room. The evening before the gala, she had dinner alone at a small Italian place near the hotel that she'd found by walking until she was hungry and stopping when something looked right. She ate pasta she didn't finish, drank half a glass of wine, and watched the street outside the window. London in June was pale and gray and intermittently beautiful, the light lasting later than it had any right to, the evening taking a long time to go dark. She had always liked this city without quite being able to explain why. It had a quality she associated with her father. Not warm, exactly, but serious. A place that took things seriously. She thought about Harold Sterling sitting at his desk in the office with the lights off. She thought about his voice on those Sunday phone calls, careful and close, the way he'd phrased questions that were actually concerns without ever quite saying so directly. She thought, "I'm going to be okay. I think you knew I would be." She paid the check and walked back to the hotel. The Whitmore Gala was held at a historic venue in Mayfair, a building that had been converted from a 19th century banking hall into an event space, which seemed appropriate, Evelyn thought, for an evening attended primarily by people who had built significant things with money. The ceilings were high and ornate, the lighting warm and deliberately flattering, and by the time she arrived at 8:30 with Alejandro and two members of the UK team, the room was already three-quarters full and moving at the particular frequency of an event where everyone was there for business but had agreed to call it something else for the evening. She wore a deep navy dress she'd bought in the city that afternoon. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself, just clean and well-cut and right. She hadn't asked anyone for an opinion on it. She'd tried it on in the store, looked at herself in the mirror for about 30 seconds, and bought it. The first hour was the standard architecture of events like this. The careful navigation of rooms, the recognition of names she knew from files and calls and annual reports, the handshakes and brief conversations, the occasional person she genuinely liked, the more occasional person who assumed a familiarity that hadn't been earned. She moved through it with the ease of someone who had done this for years, which she had, though there was a version of herself. The woman standing in a suburban kitchen with an iron tablecloth, for whom this room would have felt like a foreign country. She spotted Reginald Beaumont across the room at 45 minutes in. He was 70, heavy-set, with the contained energy of a man who had been significant for long enough that he no longer needed to demonstrate it. He was in conversation with two other men she recognized from European finance. He hadn't seen her yet, or if he had, he was choosing not to acknowledge it, which was itself a form of acknowledgement. She didn't move toward him. She moved toward the Sterling Global table, which was positioned well, not center of room, but visible from most angles, which was how she'd had it placed. She spoke to Martin Greaves, who had flown over for the occasion and was in better spirits than she'd seen him in months. She spoke to the Whitmore Foundation's executive director, a sharp woman named Carolyn, who ran the fellowship program bearing her father's name, and spoke about it with the particularity of someone who had paid close attention to what Harold Sterling had actually cared about, not just what had appeared on his donor profile. "He came to the first fellowship ceremony," Carolyn said. "He stayed for the whole thing, which donors almost never do. He asked every fellow a question personally, not polite questions, real ones, the kind that made them think." She paused. "The fellows from that year still talk about it." Evelyn held that for a moment. "That sounds like him," she said. "I was sorry when we heard," Carolyn said simply. "He was a good man." "He was a complicated man who tried to be a good one," Evelyn said. "I think that's actually harder." Carolyn smiled. "I'll remember that." It was at the 90-minute mark, during the transition between the drinks reception and the seated dinner, that she saw Nathan. He was across the room, near the entrance to the dining hall, standing with a small group that included Isabella Beaumont and two men in their 50s she didn't recognize. He was in a well-fitted tuxedo. She noted, without intending to, that he'd gotten his hair cut recently. And from this distance, and in this light, he looked like exactly what he was trying to look like. A man at home in a room like this. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched him for a moment. Not with longing. She was honest with herself about that. It wasn't longing. But with the strange specific attention you gave someone you had known in an entirely different context. Someone whose ordinary habits and expressions and ways of standing you had memorized without trying to, and who was now standing in front of you as a stranger in a tuxedo. She remembered what he looked like at 7 in the morning eating cereal over the kitchen sink. She remembered the sound of him laughing at something on television, the particular quality of his laugh, a little too loud, always a beat too late. She remembered the way he'd held her hand at her father's funeral, tightly, without saying anything. That had been the last good thing. Then Isabella said something to him, and he turned his head, and he saw Evelyn. The distance between them was probably 20 feet. The room was full of people. Someone was playing piano somewhere in a corner. All of that continued, and none of it was what she was aware of for the next several seconds. His face moved through several things quickly. Surprise. Genuine. Unguarded. Then something that looked almost like relief before he caught it and put something more controlled in its place. Then a self-consciousness that she hadn't seen on him in the kitchen the night he'd left, or on the sidewalk in February. He looked, for a fraction of a second, like a man who had just understood something in a new way and wasn't sure what to do with the understanding. Isabella's eyes followed his. She looked at Evelyn. Her expression was harder to read. She was better at composure than Nathan had ever been. But there was a quality of attentiveness in her face now that hadn't been there a moment ago. Evelyn held Nathan's gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to her conversation. She did not go to him. She did not arrange a crossing of paths. She sat through the dinner at her table, speaking to the people around her, eating a reasonable amount of the food, declining the third round of wine. She gave a brief prepared remark when the Sterling Global Fellowship Award was announced. 2 paragraphs, not a speech, focused entirely on her father and the purpose of the fellowship. She kept it short because the fellows in the room deserved the attention, not her. The room received it well. Martin leaned over afterward and said, "Your father would have liked that." "He would have corrected my phrasing on the second sentence," she said. "Yes," Martin agreed, "and he would have been right, and you both would have known it." She laughed, actually laughed, which felt like a small surprise from her own body. It had been a while since something had landed like that. It was during the post-dinner hour, the room loosening slightly, people moving between tables, that Nathan found her. She didn't see him approaching. She was in a conversation with an economic development official from the foundation's board, and when the official was drawn away by someone else and she turned, Nathan was standing approximately 2 feet to her left, with the expression of a man who had been working up to this for a while and had decided to do it before he thought his way out of it. "Evelyn," he said. "Nathan, could we?" He glanced at the room. "A few minutes. Somewhere quieter." She looked at him. His face had lost the careful social presentation it had been wearing all evening. Underneath it, he looked tired and slightly younger than she'd expected, like the tuxedo had been doing work that his face was no longer helping with. She said, "There's a corridor by the secondary entrance. 2 minutes." She moved first. He followed. The corridor was narrow and adequately lit and empty, which was as much as she'd asked for. She stopped and turned. He stopped about 3 feet away and clasped his hands in front of him, which was a habit she recognized from every difficult conversation they'd ever had. "I don't know what I expected," he said, "when I walked in tonight. But not this." "Not what?" He gestured, vague and slightly helpless. "You. This. All of it. I knew your name. I'd read about Sterling Global. Everyone in my world has read about Sterling Global for the last 6 months. But reading about it, and being in the same room as it, and knowing that you're—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't understand what I was walking away from." Evelyn looked at him steadily. She was aware of many things simultaneously. The heat of the room behind them, the distant sound of the piano, the particular quality of saying nothing while someone said too much. "You didn't walk away from the company, Nathan." "I know. You walked away from me. Me, specifically. Not a fortune or a title. Me. And what you thought about me was apparently that I was something to trade up from." "I know," he said again, and it came out differently that time. Lower, less composed. "I've thought about that. What I actually thought. What I was telling myself. There isn't a version of it that makes me look good. I thought you were less than what you turned out to be, and I thought that somehow entitled me to—" He stopped. "There isn't a word that makes this better." "No," she said. "There isn't." "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just needed to say it directly." She let the silence run for a moment. Outside, very faintly, she could hear the city. "You should go back inside," she said. "Your group will notice you're gone." He stood there another second, like he had more but no clean way to deliver it. Then he nodded. "Congratulations," he said, and it sounded like he meant it, which almost made it worse. "On what you've built, what you're building." She said nothing. He turned and went back inside. She stood in the corridor alone for about a minute. She wasn't crying, and she wasn't particularly close to it. She was feeling something, but it was quieter than she'd expected. Not the sharp, righteous satisfaction she'd sometimes imagined in the abstract, not the welling grief of an unresolved ending. something flatter and more final. The feeling of a door that had been partially open, that she'd been only half aware of still being partially open, closing all the way. She straightened her shoulders and went back inside. Reginald Beaumont found her 40 minutes later. He materialized at her side during a general milling about near the bar, moving with the deliberateness of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it efficiently. He was shorter up close than she'd pictured. He had sharp eyes under heavy brows, and the particular way of carrying himself that came from decades of being the most powerful person in most rooms he entered. "Ms. Sterling," he said. "Mr. Beaumont." She accepted the slight forward inclination that passed, in his register, for a greeting. "I've been meaning to make time for this conversation for a while," he said. "The overlap in our interests has become interesting enough to warrant a direct exchange." She kept her expression neutral. "I agree." "I'll be direct," he said. "I'm aware that the last several months have been professionally and otherwise complicated between our respective organizations. I don't think anything that's happened has been outside the normal range of competitive behavior, and I have no complaints on the business front." He paused. "On the personal front, I have an opinion, but it's my daughter's business, and I've kept it to myself." "I appreciate that," she said, and meant it. "Nathan Cole," Beaumont said, the way you said a name that had become a category rather than a person, "has not been what I was led to believe he would be. That's my error of judgment, and I own it." He looked at her directly. "I wanted you to know that I don't hold you responsible for the situation he created in my organization." She considered that. "What he shared with your people was general, not materially harmful to Sterling." Nevertheless, he let the word stand alone for a moment. "What I actually came to say is that I think there's a conversation worth having about our shared position in the Meridian Port Development Consortium. There's room for alignment there that would benefit both parties and which neither of us has pursued because of the current atmosphere." She had been watching the Meridian Port situation for months. It was a significant infrastructure project in the Eastern Development Corridor, stuck in a multi-party negotiation that had been going sideways for almost a year because 3 of the consortium members were pulling in different directions. Sterling and Beaumont were both minority stakeholders who had been watching the mess from the sidelines. "If Beaumont and Sterling aligned on the governance structure," she said slowly, "the 3-way deadlock breaks." "That's my read," Beaumont said. "You're offering a partnership." "I'm suggesting a conversation." She held his gaze. He was a careful man. He was also, she could see, a man who had done his own recalibrating over the last several months and arrived somewhere that was more aligned with reality and less aligned with the narrative his daughter's boyfriend had been selling. She didn't respect him less for that. Recalibration was hard, and most people were worse at it than they believed. "Have your office contact Alejandro Reyes on Monday," she said. "I'll clear time in the calendar." He extended his hand. She shook it. "I heard your remarks about your father," he said. "He would have been proud." "I'll take that," she said. He moved on. Evelyn found Alejandro across the room a minute later. She came up beside him and said quietly, just to him, "Beaumont wants to talk about Meridian Port." He turned slowly. "He approached you?" "Directly, yes." He processed this. "That changes the topology of the next 6 months." "I know. We'll work through it Monday." She looked out at the room, the 400 people, the high restored ceiling, the warm light, the carefully maintained performance of an evening that was also, underneath the performance, the actual exchange of real things between real people. "I want to go home tomorrow." "Flight is at 10. "Good." She stayed another 40 minutes. She said her goodbyes, thanked Carolyn again, had a brief exchange with Martin about the Q3 board meeting, and declined 2 invitations to extend the evening at someone's private club nearby. At 11:15, she walked out of the Whitmore Gala into the London night, which was finally dark but still mild, the summer holding the warmth longer than seemed reasonable. She stood on the pavement while Alejandro arranged the car, and she let herself feel the full weight of the evening, the conversations, the moment in the corridor, Nathan's face when he'd first seen her across the room, Reginald Beaumont's handshake, the fellowship named after her father, the 2 paragraphs she'd given and kept short on purpose. The car pulled up, she got in. On the flight home, somewhere over the Atlantic, she took out her notebook and wrote at the top of a blank page, "Meridian Port, Beaumont Alignment." Beneath it, she wrote 4 questions about the governance structure and 2 about the financial risk distribution that she wanted answered before Monday's call. Then she closed the notebook and looked out the window at the dark. She thought about what Nathan had said. I didn't understand what I was walking away from. She turned it over. She understood why it had landed the way it had, why it didn't feel like the conclusion she'd expected, because he still had it slightly wrong. He thought he'd been walking away from the money. He thought the mistake was the misidentification of assets. He was sorry for underestimating, which was a different thing from being sorry for the actual harm. But she didn't need him to be perfectly sorry. She didn't need him to arrive at exactly the right understanding. She had stopped needing things from Nathan Cole some time ago, and what she felt now, looking out at the dark over the water, was less like victory and more like completion. A ledger that had been open a long time was reaching its natural end, not because anyone had settled it, but because she had stopped keeping it. She thought about Carolyn saying, "He stayed for the whole thing," her father in the room, listening to every fellow, asking real questions, taking things seriously because they were serious. She thought about a corridor in Mayfair and a door closing all the way. She turned back to her notebook and wrote one more line beneath the Meridian Port questions, then reconsidered it, crossed it out, and looked out the window again. The plane flew on. The dark thinned gradually ahead of them as they outpaced the night, the horizon beginning to separate itself from the sky in a thin line of gray that meant morning was coming whether or not anyone was ready for it. She folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. She did not sleep exactly, but she rested. The Monday call with Beaumont's office happened as arranged, and the conversation about Meridian Port turned out to be more substantive than Evelyn had let herself expect. Alejandro handled the preliminary framing, which was their established pattern for sensitive negotiations. He established the tone and the parameters. She came in when the actual terms needed to be shaped. The Beaumont representative on the call was a senior managing director named Philip Haste, 55, precise, clearly operating with Reginald's direct authority and not interested in the kind of exploratory hedging that characterized early-stage conversations where neither side was fully committed. Haste came in with actual numbers, actual positions, actual willingness to discuss the governance structure that had been the sticking point for the three-way Meridian Consortium for nearly a year. By the end of the second call, which happened on Wednesday, the outline of an alignment was visible. By Friday, Alejandro had a preliminary term sheet drafted. It was not, Evelyn made sure, a merger of interests. Sterling and Beaumont were not becoming partners in any broader sense. They were aligning on one specific question in one specific project for specific mutual benefit, with clearly defined exit provisions that preserved each party's independence. She had been precise about that. Haste had understood immediately and had not pushed back, which told her that Reginald had briefed him carefully. She signed off on the preliminary terms Friday afternoon, and when she did, she sat for a moment in the particular quiet that followed a decision that had been coming for a while. The Meridian Port alignment was good for Sterling. It would break the consortium deadlock and move a significant infrastructure project forward in a way that served both the financial interests involved and the actual communities the port development was meant to benefit. It was clean work. It also happened to remove the primary business leverage point that Nathan Cole had been implicitly relying on, the ongoing friction between Sterling and Beaumont that had given his position at Beaumont its only real justification. He had been the man who understood the Sterling situation from the inside, or believed he did, and that understanding had been his value proposition in Reginald's organization. With the two firms moving toward alignment rather than competition, the value of that particular knowledge became considerably less interesting to everyone involved. She hadn't structured the Meridian alignment to accomplish that, but she'd seen it coming, and she hadn't felt the need to mention it to anyone. That was in late June. July brought its own weight. The journalist, the most senior of the three Nathan had been talking to, a business press veteran named Carol Weber, who wrote for a publication that Evelyn had read since her 20s, published a piece in the third week of July. It was not the piece Nathan had been hoping for. Evelyn knew this because she read it twice, carefully, and then read the draft that Alejandro's media contact had obtained ahead of publication, which showed clearly how substantially the story had been reshaped between Nathan's initial conversations with Weber and the final version that ran. What ran was not a scandal piece. It was a profile, a substantive, rigorously reported profile of Sterling Global's return under Evelyn's leadership, covering the Harrington integration, the Takahashi partnership, the Meridian Consortium development, and the broader strategic vision she'd been executing for 8 months. It included a single paragraph buried in the middle that noted Sterling's CEO had previously been married to a man who had subsequently joined Beaumont Capital's advisory network, and that some observers had speculated about whether personal history had influenced the competitive dynamic between the two firms. The paragraph concluded by noting that both firms declined to comment on the speculation, and that the recent alignment on Meridian Port suggested the competitive dynamic had been overstated. That was it. One paragraph. The rest of the piece was about the work. Evelyn read that middle paragraph 3 times and thought about Weber's decision-making, the sourcing she'd done, the calls she'd made, the point at which she'd clearly concluded that Nathan's version of the story didn't hold up to scrutiny, and the more interesting story was the one that didn't require a villain. She felt, briefly, something like gratitude for serious journalists who did their actual jobs. She didn't read the comments on the piece. She never read comments. What she did read, a week after the profile ran, was a notification from Alejandro that Nathan had left Beaumont Capital. No formal announcement. His name simply disappeared from the Beaumont website's team page, and a brief item in one of the financial industry trade publications noted that he had departed to pursue independent opportunities, which was the language used when the departure had been initiated by the firm rather than the individual. She registered the information and moved on. She had work to do, and the work had entered a new phase that required her full attention. The Takahashi partnership was moving into its operational stage, which meant people, logistics, and the particular challenges of integrating two organizations that had different rhythms, different internal cultures, and different assumptions about how things got done. Adrian flew to New York in mid-July for 2 weeks of working sessions, and they spent most of those 2 weeks in rooms with lawyers and operations teams and finance people working through the exact specifics of how the partnership would function in practice rather than in principle. It was at times difficult in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Not because of Adrian. He was as good in the operational weeds as he'd been in the high-level conversation, and he had a quality of attention that she found genuinely useful, the ability to hold a complex structure in his head and notice when one piece was inconsistent with another. But the teams had friction. Sterling's people and Takahashi's people had different languages for the same concepts, different tolerances for ambiguity and early-stage documentation, different assumptions about who made decisions and who was consulted before decisions were made. 2 of the working sessions went longer than scheduled because of disagreements that had to be talked through rather than papered over. One exchange between a Sterling senior associate and a Takahashi operations director got sharp enough that Evelyn interrupted it directly, which she rarely did in front of mixed teams. She pulled the Sterling associate aside afterward. His name was David Ye, 32, sharp, one of the best analysts in the company, and also someone who was occasionally too aware of being one of the best analysts in the company. "Walk me through your read on what happened in there," she said. He did. His version was coherent and partially correct. The Takahashi director had been resistant on a point that David believed was straightforwardly settled, and the resistance had started to feel obstructive rather than substantive. "And from her perspective," Evelyn said, "what do you think the read was?" He paused. "I'm not sure. She's worked in a 30-person firm for 8 years. She joined Takahashi in its 2nd year. She's done more with less than most people in this building will ever have to. She came into a room with people from a company 4 times larger than hers, and one of those people talked over her twice without seeming to notice. She kept her voice level. She's not being obstructive. She's establishing that she matters. Those are different problems." David was quiet for a moment. "I didn't hear myself do that. That's usually how it works. I'll fix it. I know you will. That's why I'm telling you instead of Alejandro." He nodded and went back in. The rest of the session ran better. She had a conversation that evening, after everyone else had cleared out, with Adrian, who had stayed late going through a financial model. They ordered food in because neither of them wanted to change clothes and find a restaurant, and they ate at the conference table with the model pulled up on the screen and the city going dark behind the windows. "Your guy today," Adrian said over whatever they'd ordered. "He's good." "He is. He's also 20 years away from knowing how much he doesn't know." "Isn't that all of us?" "Some people close that gap faster than others." Adrian leaned back. "My lead on the infrastructure side. The woman he had the exchange with. Her name is Keiko. She spent 6 years working development projects in markets that most Western firms write off as too complicated, and she's consistently delivered. She has zero patience for being talked over, which is correct, but she also sometimes leads with resistance when she's feeling underestimated, and then the substance gets lost in the atmosphere. He paused. I've been trying to figure out how to tell her that without it landing as be more deferential. Evelyn thought about this. Tell her what you told me just now, exactly like that. She'll hear it. You think? You weren't asking her to change her position. You were asking her to choose her timing better so her position actually lands. That's a different thing. There's a version of that conversation that goes badly. Yes, have it anyway. He looked at her for a moment. You're very direct. Is that a complaint? No, he said. It's an observation. He picked up his fork. It's not common. They ate for a minute in companionable quiet. Outside, the city made its steady noise. Can I ask you something off the business track? He said. She considered. Depends what it is. The profile in the business press last week. I read it. The middle paragraph. He said it without preamble or apology, which she respected. Is the situation resolved, or is it still active? She took a moment. Define active. Meaning, is it taking up space in your operating system, or has it been filed? She thought about that framing. It was the right kind of precision. Filed, she said. Some time ago, actually. The public piece of it just caught up. Okay, he said, and moved on, which was exactly the right response. She found herself thinking about that later, about the economy of that exchange, the way a well-placed question and a complete answer could establish a kind of understanding that most people spent weeks or months of tentative conversation trying to arrive at. She was not thinking about Adrian romantically. They were business partners, and she was 8 months out of a marriage, and she was not in any state to be thinking about anyone romantically. But she was aware of finding him, as a person, considerably more worth talking to than most people she talked to professionally, and that was something she filed separately and didn't examine too closely. August was quieter, by design. She had pushed hard for 9 months, and she could feel it. Not in any dramatic way, not in breakdown or crisis, but in small signs she'd learned to read from earlier years, when she'd been younger and ignored the signs until they became something harder to ignore. She slept too little and ate inconsistently and had a persistent tension across her shoulders that 2 different attempts at regular exercise had not resolved. She needed a slower month. She had never been good at taking slower months, but she was getting better at recognizing when she needed one. She gave herself 3 long weekends in August. She used them imperfectly. She checked email. She took calls she'd promised herself she wouldn't take. She read reports on Sunday evenings when she'd told herself she wouldn't. But she also walked, for the first time in months, without a destination. She went to 2 museum exhibitions she'd had in her calendar since spring and hadn't gotten to. She cooked 3 actual meals in her apartment, which was 3 more than she'd cooked since moving in. On the second of those long weekends, a Saturday, she found herself in a gallery in the West Village that she'd wandered into without planning to, following a street she didn't usually take. It was a medium-sized space, not a major gallery, showing a collection of large-format photographs from a series called Remaining. Images of industrial spaces after the industry had left, the Rust Belt, the coastal towns, the grain elevators, and the factories and the storefronts, all of it emptied and going quiet. They were not pretty photographs exactly, but they were honest in a way that held her attention longer than she'd expected. She was in front of the 3rd image, a grain elevator in a small Ohio town, the light coming through a gap in the rusted roof in a single shaft, everything else in controlled shadow, when someone came to stand beside her. The light in that one took 4 days to get right, the person said. The angle only worked for about 40 minutes in the early afternoon, and it rained for 3 of those 4 days. She turned. He was in his early 40s, she estimated, medium height, wearing a canvas jacket over a dark shirt, with the particular quality of unhurriedness that she associated with people who spent a lot of time looking at things. He had an honest face, which was a quality she had not always been good at identifying in people, but had gotten better at. "You took these?" she said. "Made them," he said, with the slight correction of someone who felt the distinction mattered. "Ethan Brooks." "Evelyn." They shook hands. He waited a moment to see if she would add more. When she didn't, he accepted that without apparent discomfort. "What brought you to this one specifically?" he asked. "Out of the series." She looked back at the grain elevator. "It looks like something in the middle of deciding what it is now," she said. "Not ruins, exactly. Not abandoned, just between things." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the most accurate description anyone's given me of what I was trying to do." What were most people's descriptions? Melancholy, loss, the death of American manufacturing. He said it with the slight tiredness of someone who had heard the same interpretation from many people. "Which isn't wrong, but it's not the whole picture." "No," she agreed. "Between things is different from over." They talked for 20 minutes. About the series, about the places he'd traveled to make it, about what it was like to spend time in spaces that most people drove past without stopping. He was curious and specific and didn't perform any of it. He asked her what she did and she told him simply, and he received it without the particular recalibration. The sudden shift in register, the change in how close they were standing, that money and titles usually produced in people when they heard them for the first time. When she said she had to go, he said, "There's a closing event next Saturday evening, if you're interested. It's low-key, not a gala." She looked at him. He said it the way a person said a thing they meant but were not particularly attached to the outcome of, which was a quality she had developed over the last year a very high regard for. "I'll try to make it," she said. She did make it. She also returned to the gallery the following week, and the week after that, for reasons that had less to do with the photographs, though she continued to find the photographs worth looking at. In September, Nathan Cole's situation became public in a way that had nothing to do with Evelyn and everything to do with Nathan. The sequence of events was not complex, but it was swift. After leaving Beaumont Capital, Nathan had spent 6 weeks in what his LinkedIn profile described as a consulting transition, during which he had apparently been in conversation with 2 smaller investment firms about a senior role. Evelyn knew this from Alejandro, who tracked these things as a matter of professional habit. She did not involve herself in it or discuss it beyond the initial briefing. What she hadn't known, and what became public knowledge in the second week of September, was that during his time at Beaumont, Nathan had been involved in introducing a specific private investor, a man named Gerard Walsh, to a deal that had been structured in a way that Walsh later claimed he had not been accurately represented to. Walsh filed a civil complaint. The complaint was against Beaumont Capital as the primary party, with Nathan named as a secondary participant in the allegedly misleading representations. Evelyn read about it in the financial press on a Tuesday morning. She called Alejandro immediately. "Our exposure?" "None," he said. "Walsh is not a sterling party. The deal has no sterling involvement. Our only connection is historical. Nathan's former marriage, which is a matter of public record and not a legal issue." "Is there any risk someone tries to draw us in?" Walsh's lawyers have been thorough in their preliminary filings. They've mapped the transaction chain carefully. We're not on the map. She set the phone down. She looked out the window. She had not put Nathan in this position. She needed to be clear with herself about that, and she was. Nathan had gotten into Gerard Walsh's deal long before Evelyn came back to Sterling Global, long before the Beaumont alignment, long before any of the past 10 months. He had made the choices that put him in a room with Walsh. He had made the representations that Walsh was now contesting. None of that had a sterling return address. She also did not feel the particular satisfaction she'd sometimes imagined feeling when something like this happened. That clean, sharp pleasure of a deserved consequence arriving visibly. What she felt was more muddled than that, something with sadness still in it. Not for Nathan, exactly. She was done carrying Nathan's losses. But for the general human tendency to build on unstable ground and then act surprised when it shifted. She had done her own version of it years ago in a kitchen in the suburbs with an iron tablecloth and a dinner that took 3 hours. Different ground, different instability, same basic human failure of wanting something to be solid when the signs were telling her otherwise. She turned back to the stack of work on her desk. The Walsh complaint moved through its early procedural stages over the following weeks. Beaumont Capital issued a measured statement through their legal team. Nathan's representative, he had a lawyer now, which was an expense she imagined he hadn't budgeted for, issued a separate statement that described the allegations as unfounded and noted his full cooperation with the process. The financial press covered it with the efficient thoroughness they applied to any legal action involving a known firm, and within 3 weeks it was established as a background item rather than a front-page story. Serious, potentially consequential, but not yet resolved. Isabella Beaumont's relationship with Nathan became past tense somewhere in this period. It was not announced anywhere, but she was photographed at 2 subsequent public events without him, and his name stopped appearing in the social items that tracked her movements. And eventually it was simply apparent that the personal arrangement that had accompanied the professional one had concluded along with it. Evelyn did not take any position on this. When Alejandro mentioned it in passing during a briefing, more as a contextual note than anything else, she acknowledged it and moved on to the next item. What occupied her that fall was the Takahashi partnership entering its first real test. The Southeast Asia Infrastructure Corridor project had hit a permitting complication in one of the target markets, a bureaucratic delay that was partly administrative and partly political, the kind of obstacle that had ended similar projects before because the parties involved hadn't had the patience or the local knowledge depth to navigate it. Keiko, Adrian's infrastructure lead, had the relationships on the ground that mattered, but the financial restructuring required to keep the project viable during the delay needed Sterling's backing, which meant Evelyn had to make a decision about commitment level before the full picture was clear. She and Adrian spent 2 evenings in early October going through the numbers, the risk scenarios, the alternatives. He'd come to her office both times, and both times they'd worked until well past when they'd intended to, the food delivery arriving and getting cold while they argued over projections. "Here's what I keep coming back to," he said on the second evening. "The delay is probably 6 to 9 months. Worst case, 14. The project is fundamentally sound, but Keiko's assessment, the independent analysis, they both say the same thing. The complication is operational, not structural." "Agreed. Then the question is whether Sterling can hold its position for up to 14 months while generating negative cash flow on this investment." "We can," she said. "The question is whether we should." He looked at her. "You think the risk is higher than the independent analysis?" "I think the independent analysis is accurate," she said. "I also think there's a scenario, not the most likely one, but real, where the political piece doesn't resolve on the timeline anyone is projecting, and we're at 18 months with a project that's still viable in theory and running through capital in practice." She paused. "If that happens, what does Takahashi Ventures look like at the 18-month mark?" He was quiet. She knew he'd run this already. She was asking him to say it out loud. "Tight," he said. "Very tight." "I know. That's the number I keep coming back to." She turned her pen in her hand. "I'm not saying we pull out. I'm saying we need a circuit breaker clause in the partnership structure that gives both parties a clean decision point at the 12-month mark. Not an automatic exit, a mandatory review with defined criteria. If we hit the criteria, we proceed. If we don't, we negotiate options." He thought about this. Keiko will read that as lack of confidence. Then we explain it to her before the clause goes in the document. We tell her what you told me, that the project is sound, that this is capital discipline, not doubt. She looked at him. "She'll hear it if it comes from you, directly." He held her gaze for a moment. "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "Telling me to have the hard conversation. Am I wrong?" "No," he said. He leaned back. "No, you're not wrong." The circuit breaker clause went into the revised partnership structure. Keiko received it, per Alejandro's later report, with the direct explanation Adrian gave her, and responded with a counterproposal on the specific criteria that was actually more rigorous than what they'd drafted. They accepted her counter. The revised document was better for it. Nathan Cole, during all of this, was finding out what the opposite of a circuit breaker clause felt like, which was the experience of having no defined stopping point on a downward trajectory. The Walsh complaint had moved from civil filing to formal discovery by October, which meant Nathan was producing documents, submitting to depositions, and paying a lawyer at an hourly rate that his current income, which appeared to be limited to whatever consulting work he'd managed to pick up in the interim, was unlikely to comfortably sustain. The 2 firms he'd been in conversations with about senior roles had, quietly, stopped returning calls. He called Evelyn in October. She didn't recognize the number. He was calling from a different phone than the one she'd had for him, and she answered because she always answered unknown numbers during business hours. When she heard his voice, She felt the particular internal adjustment of a person receiving information they hadn't prepared for. "Evelyn," he said, "I know I'm not in a position to be asking you for anything." "Then why are you calling?" "I needed to hear your voice," he said, and it came out like he hadn't quite planned to say it that plainly, like it arrived before his judgment did. She was quiet for a moment. "Nathan," she said, "I'm going to say this as clearly as I can. I don't wish you specific harm. I also can't help you. Not because I'm punishing you. Because you need to find your own way through what you've built, and me stepping in would take that away from you in a way that helps neither of us." She kept her voice even. "Don't call me again." She ended the call. She sat at her desk for about 30 seconds, not moving, with the phone face down on the desk. Then she picked it up, opened her calendar, confirmed her meeting for the following morning, and sent a message to Alejandro about the Meridian Port governance timeline. She was not without feeling about the call. She would be lying to herself if she claimed otherwise. Somewhere in the complex, sedimentary accumulation of what Nathan Cole had been to her — husband, betrayer, bad actor, complicated person she had loved — there was still something that moved when he was in pain. She didn't think that made her weak. She thought it made her honest about the actual texture of human feeling, which was rarely as clean as the conclusions you arrived at. But honest feeling and wise action were not always the same thing. She knew that now in a way she hadn't known it at 29, standing in a field of her own best hopes and calling them certainty. You could feel something fully and still decide not to act on it. That was not suppression. That was just the difference between being a person and being a series of reactions. She had been a series of reactions for long enough. She was something else now. That evening, she met Ethan at a small place in the neighborhood they'd found together on their third time spending a Saturday afternoon in the same direction. He was already there when she arrived, at a corner table, reading something on his phone that he put away when he saw her without the particular self-consciousness of someone managing an impression. He looked up and smiled, not a performance of a smile, just a smile, and said, "You look tired." "I had a complicated afternoon. Do you want to talk about it?" "Not yet," she said. "Maybe after food." "Okay," he said. He handed her the menu. They ordered. The food came. She ate more than she'd expected to. Somewhere in the middle of the meal, she found herself telling him, in general terms, about Nathan's call. Not the whole backstory. They hadn't gotten to the whole backstory yet, but enough that the shape of the afternoon made sense. He listened without interrupting, without offering an analysis she hadn't asked for, without saying that must have been hard in the way that people said it when they were filling space. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need right now?" he said. She thought about it. "To not be in any of that for a couple of hours." "Easy," he said. "I went to a building in the Bronx last week that I think you'd find interesting. Let me tell you about it." He did. She listened. The evening moved on. Outside, the city was doing what cities did in October, pulling its collar up, getting cooler, the light going copper in the early evenings, all of it indifferent to individual stories in the useful way that places larger than people were always indifferent. Evelyn walked home later in the dark, hands in her coat pockets, taking the longer route. She wasn't thinking about anything specific. She was just walking. The city was around her, enormous and unaware of her, and she was in it, not above it, not at a distance from it, just in it, one person among millions, carrying the weight of her days and the ongoing ordinary difficulty of being alive and trying to do it well. She thought briefly about her father walking this same city 30 years ago, figuring out his own version of the same set of problems, building something out of what he had, making the mistakes that couldn't be avoided, trying to be a complicated person who was also a good one. She thought, "I'm still figuring out the shape of it, but I'm figuring it out." She turned the corner toward her building. The light above the entrance was on. She went inside. November came in hard that year. The first cold front arrived on a Monday, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in 18 hours, and the city shifted the way it always shifted in the genuine onset of winter. Not dramatically, but in aggregate, in the small accumulations of people walking faster and collars turned up, and the particular gray quality of the light at 4 in the afternoon when it was already going dark. Evelyn noticed it on her way into the office and thought, without meaning to, about the November a year ago when she'd stood at a kitchen window watching headlights on wet pavement, waiting for a man who arrived carrying an ending. A year. She turned that over in her mind in the elevator, going up. It didn't feel like a year. It felt like several different lifetimes compressed into a single one. And it also, paradoxically, felt like almost nothing had changed. Like she was the same person who had ironed a tablecloth and driven 40 minutes for Saffron and told herself the word reset. And the same person who had stood in a London corridor watching a door close. And the same person who had walked home in October cold thinking about her father building his own version of the same set of problems. She was all of those women simultaneously, which was not a comfortable thing, but was, she had come to understand, the actual truth of how people worked. You didn't become someone new. You became more completely yourself, which was sometimes harder and sometimes easier, and always more complicated than anyone prepared you for. She sat down at her desk. She opened her calendar. She had a full day. The Meridian Port project closed its governance restructuring in the second week of November, and it was the kind of close that everyone felt. Not with celebration exactly, more with the collective exhale of a room that had been holding its breath for months. The three-party consortium that had been deadlocked for nearly a year had a functioning agreement. The project, which was a deepwater port facility serving 4 markets that had been severely underserved by existing infrastructure, would break ground in the spring. Conservative estimates put its economic impact at 9,000 direct jobs across the development corridor and supply chain effects that would reach considerably further. Evelyn stood at the window in the Sterling Global Conference Room while the legal teams handled the final documentation, and she thought about the thing that almost nobody talked about in this business, the actual people at the end of the chain. The port wasn't an abstraction. It was not a line item or a yield projection or a row in a model. It was dock workers and logistics coordinators, and the small businesses that grew around infrastructure, and the communities that had been waiting for the kind of sustained economic attention that usually went elsewhere. Her father had talked about this. He'd been old-fashioned about it in a way that some people had found sentimental. The idea that capital was not an end in itself, but a tool, and the question that mattered was what you built with it and who it reached. She had not always lived that philosophy. She had spent years in the pure mechanics of deal-making, the sophisticated architecture of financial instruments, and she had been good at it, but good at mechanics was not the same as good in the sense Harold Sterling had meant. She thought she was getting closer. She was not there yet. She suspected there was a moving target, which she had also come to accept as one of the more honest things about the kind of work that mattered. Alejandro came to stand beside her. He looked out at the city, the way he sometimes did when there was something he was working towards saying. "Your father would have wanted to be in that room today," he said. "He would have been insufferable about the governance clause structure," she said. "He would have had 17 notes." 18, Alejandro said. "He always had an extra one that he held back to give after you thought the conversation was over." She laughed. "I forgot about that. You do the same thing." She turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the window, which was his way of letting her know he was serious without making it a confrontation. "I didn't know that," she said. "You wouldn't. It's not visible from the inside." He paused. "He used to say the last question was the one that told you whether someone was really listening or just waiting for you to finish." She was quiet for a moment. "How long did you work for him?" she said. She knew the answer. She was asking it differently. 31 years, Alejandro said. "Long enough that when you came back, I had to remember the difference between serving the company and serving Harold Sterling." He turned from the window. "It took me about 3 weeks to remember you aren't him." "And after 3 weeks? After 3 weeks I started working for you," he said simply, "which I should have done from the first day." She held that. "Why didn't you?" "Because you came back broken in places, and I kept waiting for you to become the person I knew from the files." He said it without apology, the way he said most things. But the person in the files was 25 and had never had a real loss. What you are now is more useful. More useful is not exactly a compliment. "I meant it as one," he said. She looked at him. 61 years old, silver-haired, the man who had held her father's company together for 14 months of her absence after Harold died, who had cleared an office and kept it ready on the off chance that she'd come back to it, who had been in the room for every significant decision of the last 12 months without ever once making it about himself. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, not just today." He accepted this with a nod that was small and complete, the kind of nod that closed a subject without dismissing it. Then he said, "The legal team needs you back at the table for the final signatures." 30 seconds, she said. He went back in. She stood at the window for 30 seconds exactly, looking at the city, giving herself that much, and then she went back to the table and signed her name. The Takahashi partnership's first real operational test resolved in December. The permitting complication in the Southeast Asia corridor, the delay that had prompted the circuit breaker clause, the late-night number sessions, the hard conversations about capital exposure and organizational strain, came through faster than the pessimistic projection and slower than the optimistic one, which was, as Adrian said when he called her with the news, the most statistically honest outcome we could have hoped for. 14 months, she said. 11 and a half, he corrected. We hit the 12-month review clause, ran the criteria, cleared them. Keiko's team has been on the ground for the last 6 weeks building the local logistics chain ahead of the green light. She moved early. She was confident the criteria would clear. She didn't want to lose 2 months of groundwork waiting for documentation to catch up. He paused. She was right to do it. She was also taking a risk. Yes. And she knew she was. And she did it anyway because the project mattered more to her than being safe. Another pause. "I think you'd like her, actually. If you met her." Evelyn thought about Keiko's counterproposal on the circuit breaker criteria, which had been more rigorous than what they'd drafted, and better for it. She thought about the working session where David had talked over her twice, and the way she'd come back with something useful instead of something wounded. "I already do," she said. The call went on for another 40 minutes. By the end of it, they had agreed on a January trip to the project site, both of them, with their respective team leads, and had blocked 3 days for a comprehensive operational review. It was the kind of commitment that required clearing a significant section of January calendar, and she did it without hesitation. She had not thought about whether she liked Adrian in the personal sense. She had been thinking about it slightly more than that recently, which she acknowledged to herself with the pragmatic honesty she applied to everything else. He was a person she found genuinely worth being around, which was rarer than it should have been. He was also her business partner, which was a complexity. She was aware of both of these things simultaneously and was not in any rush to do anything about either of them. There was something she had learned in the last year about the productive quality of patience. Not passive waiting, not avoidance, but the actual discipline of letting things develop at the pace they needed to develop without forcing a shape onto them before they were ready. She had forced a shape onto things before. She remembered how that ended. Ethan came to her mind in that context, and she let it sit there. He was a person she had spent time with regularly for 3 months now, in the easy and imperfect way of two adults whose lives intersected with enough frequency and enough genuine interest to keep them coming back without drama. He knew her work in general terms. She knew his work in the same terms. They cooked dinner in his apartment twice, which was a more domestic gesture than either of them had specifically planned. And both times the dinners were roughly half as good as intended, and neither of them cared. He had met Alejandro briefly, and afterward said, "He watches you the way someone watches the weather. He's not worried about you. He just wants to know what's coming." She had found that description accurate enough to be unsettling. They were not, as of December, in any defined arrangement. That was fine. The definition could wait. What was real whether it had a name or not, and she had stopped needing names on things before they earned them. On a Saturday in the second week of December, she went to Hyde Park. It was her idea, which surprised her slightly when she recognized it as such. She was not a person who went to parks with intention, or had been, in the city years of her early career. But she woke up that Saturday morning with a clear need for cold air and open space, and the particular quality of winter light that parks held in a way that city streets didn't, and she dressed and left the apartment before she could talk herself into doing something more productive. The park was quiet at 9 in the morning in December. Not empty. There were joggers, dog walkers, a few families, the occasional person sitting on a bench with the specific stillness of someone who had come there with something to think through. She walked without a route, following whatever path presented itself, her hands in her coat pockets, her breath visible in the cold. She had been walking for about 20 minutes when she sat down on a bench near the edge of the lake. The water was still, the color of pewter, reflecting a sky that couldn't quite decide between clouds and clarity. A pair of ducks moved along the near edge without particular urgency. The city was audible in the background. It was always audible. This was not the countryside, but distantly, like something happening in another room. She sat there and let herself think, which was different from the working kind of thinking she did constantly. This was the other kind, the kind without an agenda. She thought about a year, the actual span of it, the weight of it, the number of things that had happened inside it that she hadn't planned and couldn't have predicted. The boardroom and the hotel room and the London corridor, the circuit breaker clause and the grain elevator photograph and the October phone call she'd ended cleanly. The man who had held her hand at a funeral and then brought divorce papers to an anniversary dinner. The man who spent 4 days waiting for the right light. She thought about the tablecloth she'd ironed. There was a version of herself, not a different person, but an earlier arrangement of the same person, who had needed that dinner to work so badly that she'd ironed a tablecloth, who had driven 40 minutes for saffron, who had told herself reset with the conviction of someone who suspected otherwise but couldn't quite afford to know it yet. She didn't have contempt for that woman. She understood her. She had been her, completely, without reservation, and the fact that the woman had been wrong about something didn't make her foolish. It made her human in the exact way that humans were human, which was to say, capable of wanting something so much that the wanting itself became a kind of argument, and the argument was harder to hear your way out of from the inside. She thought about Nathan, not with longing, not with anger. Those registers were closed now in a way that felt permanent rather than provisional. She thought about him the way you thought about a person who had been genuinely important to you, and who had failed you in ways you had not deserved, and who was also a person who had made his own set of very human mistakes and was now living inside the consequences of them. She did not know what Nathan's life looked like in December. She knew from Alejandro's last briefing on the Walsh matter that the civil complaint had been settled in November, the terms not disclosed, which was standard, but the settlement itself suggesting that the evidence had been unfavorable enough to Beaumont and Nathan, both that resolution was preferable to continued exposure. She knew that Nathan had taken a position at a small consulting firm in Connecticut, the kind of role that was a long distance from what he'd been reaching for when he'd set divorce papers next to anniversary candles. She did not know whether he was okay. She did not know whether Isabella Beaumont had been kind or cold about the end of their arrangement, or whether he'd found something elsewhere, or whether the apartment he'd been paying too much for was still emptying his reserves. She did not wish him specific harm. She also was not going to extend the energy of worrying about him. Those were two things she could hold simultaneously, and she did. What she felt sitting on the bench in the cold with the pewter lake in front of her and the ducks moving without urgency along the shore was something she didn't have a clean word for and had stopped trying to name. It was not happiness in the bright, simple sense. It was something more structural than that, something that sat in the bones rather than the surface, the feeling of a person who has been genuinely tested and has come through it not unscathed but intact. She had lost things in the last year. Real things, things she had cared about, a marriage, and a version of her life, and a particular set of beliefs about herself and other people that had turned out not to be fully accurate. Loss was not nothing. She was not pretending it was nothing. But she had also found things. She had found the work again, not as a refuge or a distraction, but as a genuine expression of who she was, what she was good at, what she wanted to do with the hours of her days. She had found Alejandro as something more than a professional arrangement, as a person who had known her father and carried that forward in a way that gave her something she hadn't known she needed. She had found, tentatively and without forcing a shape onto it, the possibility of people worth trusting again. Not many. 2. Maybe 3. But real ones. She had found, most fundamentally, the thing she had left to find, though it hadn't arrived the way she'd imagined it would, in some clear moment of revelation, but in accumulation, in the daily practice of small, honest decisions and the gradual building of a life that was actually hers. She had needed to know who she was without the empire. What she had discovered was that she was the empire too. Not because it defined her, but because she had built it into herself over years of attention and work and care, and walking away from it hadn't made her less herself. It had just hidden part of herself from view. Taking it back hadn't made her whole in some triumphant sense. It had just restored the full picture. She was not the hidden heiress anymore. She was not the betrayed wife either. She was not the woman in the kitchen or the woman at the head of the boardroom table. Or rather, she was all of those women simultaneously. The way people were always all of their previous selves simultaneously, carrying everything forward even when they couldn't see it. She sat with all of that in the cold, the city breathing its distant breath around her, the ducks completing some errand of their own along the lake shore. Then she got up and walked back the way she came. The annual Sterling Global Board meeting happened on the second Thursday of December, as it always had under her father's tenure and as she had maintained it. The boardroom on the 43rd floor was the same boardroom, same table, same window, same view. But the people around the table had shifted in the year since her return. Martin Greaves was there, as he always was. The two members she'd been uncertain about in January had found their footing, one of them through a direct conversation she'd had in March, and the other through the slower process of watching Evelyn make decisions for 10 months and concluding that the decisions were sound. The board was not harmonious in the frictionless sense. She didn't want it to be. Friction between capable people was how bad ideas got caught. But it was functional and clear-eyed and engaged with the actual work. She opened the meeting by reading a single number out loud, the year-end revenue figure, which was up 23% from the year prior. She let that land. Then she said, "I want to spend most of this meeting on the next 3 years, not the last one. We can all read the annual report." And they moved on. 2 hours in, during a break, Martin came to stand beside her at the window, which was where she always stood during breaks because the window was where she thought best. "Your father would have been pleased with this year," he said. "He would have been pleased with the number," she said. "He would have had questions about the execution in the European Division Q3. He always had questions about the European Division. The European Division always gave him reasons to." She paused. "But yes, I think he would have been pleased." "And you?" Martin said. "Are you pleased?" She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "I'm satisfied with what we built," she said. "I'm not finished." He nodded. "That's the right answer." "It's the true one," she said. "I'm not sure they're always the same thing." "In my experience," Martin said, "they're the same thing more often than people expect." He finished his coffee. "Your father said something to me once, a long time ago. He said, 'The work is never really about the work. It's about what the work lets you become. The work is just the form the becoming takes.'" She looked at him. "I've been saving that for a year," he said, without irony. She turned back to the window. "He would have waited until he was absolutely sure I could hear it." "Yes," Martin said, "he would have." The meeting resumed. The afternoon ran long, as it always did in December, and by the time she took the elevator down, alone, it was past 6, and the city was fully dark, the windows of the buildings across the street bright against the sky. She stood on the sidewalk and called Ethan. He answered on the third ring, slightly out of breath, which meant he'd been developing film in his darkroom, which he did on Thursday evenings, and had had to cross the studio to get to his phone. "How was the board meeting?" he said. "Long. Good." She started walking. "Are you busy tonight?" "I was going to finish a few prints. I could stop." "Don't stop on my account." "I want to stop," he said. "The prints will still be there tomorrow. Where are you?" "Walking south on 6th. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I'll order food." "Something warm," she said. "It's cold." "Obviously something warm," he said. 20 minutes. She kept walking. The city was cold and bright and busy with the specific energy of a December Thursday evening. People moving with purpose, cabs occupied, the holiday lights on the storefronts contributing their particular unrealistic cheerfulness to the overall atmosphere. She walked through it without hurrying, her hands in her pockets, her breath small and visible. She thought about her father. She thought about the fellowship in London bearing his name, and the fellows who were doing the work he'd funded, building things in his absence that he would have asked real questions about. She thought about the way Carolyn had said, "He stayed for the whole thing." She thought about what it meant to stay for the whole thing, to be present not for the highlight, the announcement, the signing, the number, but for the actual duration of it, the part that wasn't performed. She had spent 7 years leaving and 1 year returning. But in a different sense, she had been doing what she was always meant to do, figuring out how to stay for the whole thing. How to be present, not in the strategic sense, but in the actual sense. The way her father had been present, the way she was slowly becoming. She was not her father. She was learning from him, which was different, and probably what he had intended. She turned a corner, 2 more blocks. She thought about Nathan for a moment, allowed herself that briefly, the way you allowed yourself a held breath before releasing it. She thought about what he'd said in London, standing in the corridor. I didn't understand what I was walking away from. She had thought, on the flight home, that he still had it wrong, that he'd confused the fortune for the person. But turning it over again now, a month after the October phone call, she thought that maybe what he'd said was more accurate than she'd given it credit for. Maybe he had understood by then that what he'd walked away from was not the company or the money or even the marriage. What he'd walked away from was a person who had loved him with her whole attention, without performance, without condition, and who had made herself ordinary for his sake because she believed that love was worth that, and who had deserved better than to be treated as a limitation. He had finally understood that. Too late and in the wrong order, but he had gotten there. She didn't know what that was worth to him. She knew it was worth nothing to her in practical terms, which was not the same as saying it meant nothing. It meant the sad, ordinary thing it meant, that people sometimes only understood the value of what they had after they destroyed it, and that this was a very common human failure that she was not exempt from in her own way, in her own history. She was not without her own inventory of things understood too late. She had stayed 7 years longer than the evidence warranted because she had confused wanting something to work with it actually working. She had made herself smaller so a person could feel bigger, which was a kindness that had crossed into complicity somewhere in the middle years without her fully noticing. She had chosen love over inheritance with the certainty of the young, and had lost both for a while before finding her way back to both in different forms. She did not consider those years wasted. She considered them expensive, which was different. You paid for what you learned. Sometimes you overpaid. The question was whether the learning was real. 2 blocks became 1. The building was visible. She thought about Adrian, who would be on a call with his Tokyo team in the morning, and about Keiko already on the ground building a logistics chain before the green light because the project mattered more than being safe. She thought about the Southeast Asia corridor and the Deepwater port, and the 9,000 direct jobs, and the communities that had been waiting. She thought about what it meant to put capital to work in a way that reached the actual end of the chain. She thought about the work, and what the work let you become. She thought about what she still wanted to do. The list was not short. Sterling Global was a platform. It was not the whole of what she was, and she had been increasingly certain, in the last few months, that the next phase would require a structure beyond what a single company, even a significant one, could provide. There were ideas she had been sitting with about a separate investment vehicle, something focused entirely on the corridor development work, the sustainable infrastructure projects, the kind of long-horizon capital deployment that institutional investors almost never had patience for, but that produced the most lasting change. She had talked to Adrian about it in general terms. He had not been quiet in the thoughtful way that meant he was finding problems. He had been quiet in the way that meant he was already constructing the architecture. She had a lot of work to do. She was not done. She did not expect to be done for a very long time, which was, she had come to understand, not a burden, but the actual thing. The reason to get up in the morning, the substance of a life taken seriously. She reached the building. She buzzed. Ethan's voice came through the intercom, slightly distorted, entirely familiar. "Come up, food's on the way." She pushed through the door. The elevator was small and slow, and she took it because she was tired. It rose with its deliberate, unhurried pace, the way elevators did, indifferent to anyone's urgency, and she stood in it alone and felt the full weight of the day and the year and all the specific accumulated days inside the year. Everything that had happened, and everything she had built and lost and found and built again. The elevator stopped. The door opened. The hallway smelled like the darkroom chemicals that always faintly reached into the apartment on Thursday evenings, and somewhere inside there was music at low volume and the sound of someone moving around a kitchen with the comfortable noise of a person in their own space. Through the apartment window at the end of the hall, she could see the city, enormous and lit, doing what it always did with its millions of simultaneous stories, none of them aware of the others, all of them real. She knocked once and opened the door. "In here," Ethan called from the kitchen. 2 minutes. She took off her coat. She hung it up. She walked into the apartment that was not hers, but had begun to feel like somewhere she could be honestly herself, which was the thing she had been looking for longer than she'd known she was looking. She was not finished. She was not healed in the complete sense, if that sense even existed. She was not her father's daughter in the simple way, not her mother's daughter in any practical way anymore. Not a wife, not a hidden anything, not a woman in a kitchen ironing tablecloths and telling herself a word that didn't fit the situation. She was Evelyn Sterling, 41 years old, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company and architect of something larger still. A woman who had loved badly and lost years and come back through all of it to a version of herself that was more complete, more honest, more capable of the kind of presence that her father had modeled. Not perfect, not finished, but real and in motion and fully, finally, her own. She sat down. Ethan came out of the kitchen carrying 2 bowls of something that smelled like it would be good. He set them down, sat across from her, looked at her in the direct and unhurried way he looked at everything. "Long year," he said. "Yes," she said. "Better or worse than you expected?" She thought about it. She thought about all of it. The tablecloth, the divorce papers, the 43rd floor, the corridor in London, the phone call she had ended cleanly, the circuit breaker clause, the bench in the park, the pewter lake, the ducks with their own quiet errands. "Both," she said, "at the same time." He nodded like that made complete sense, because to him it did, and picked up his spoon. She picked up hers. Outside, the city continued its enormous and different life, all those millions of simultaneous stories moving through the night, some of them breaking open, some of them closing quietly, some of them beginning in ways their people couldn't yet see. This one was not over, but it had found its footing, and that, she had learned the hard way and was no longer taking for granted, was where everything real began.